Hello, and welcome back to History for the HSC. And as promised in our last deep dive, we're coming back to look once more at Nazi legislation. And today we will again look at four significant pieces of these laws that gave the Nazis control over the German people. So, let's get started. As mentioned in our last video, we're doing two videos on Nazi legislation. And again today we're looking at the same syllabus outcome. The various methods used by the Nazi regime to exercise control, including laws, censorship, repression, terror, propaganda, and the cult of personality. We've already, in a previous video, looked at propaganda, the cult of personality, and censorship. We've already begun in a previous video to look at laws, and of course today we're continuing to look at more laws that were relevant to the Nazis' ability to exercise control. In our last video, we looked at the Enabling Act, the Reichstag Fire Decree, the law against the establishment of parties, and the law concerning the highest state office of the Reich. And today we have four more laws to add. Firstly, we will have a look at the Editorial Law, which gave Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda control over the media. Secondly, we'll take some time to consider the two Hitler Youth laws, which gave the regime a means of control over the youth of Germany. Third, we'll consider the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which is a significant law in regard to the Holocaust and attacks on the Jewish population in Germany. And lastly, we'll consider the Gleichshaltung Laws, coordinating the state and Nazifying Germany. And so with that said, let's get started. The first piece of legislation that we want to consider today is the Editorial Law, sometimes called the Editor's Law. Hitler and Goebbels together would work out the specifics of this law, and it would be announced on October the 4th, 1933. However, it would only come into force on January the 1st, 1934. This law firstly controlled who could work as an editor within any newspaper in the Reich. Under Section 5, only Aryan German citizens would be able to apply for admission into this editorial profession. And any application for admission into the editorial profession could be rejected by the Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, that is, Joseph Goebbels. And further, Goebbels would have the ability to remove any currently serving newspaper editor. The result of this was that all newspapers would be run by those who would support the Nazification process and Nazi control in Germany, either doing so willingly as they themselves supported the Nazis, or by tacit approval, staying silent out of fear. Significantly, Section 14 of the Editorial Law stated the following: editors are especially bound to keep out of the newspapers anything which tends to weaken the strength of the German Reich outwardly or inwardly, the common will of the German peoples, the German defensibility, culture, or economy, or offends the religious sentiments of others. What this effectively meant was that only the stories the Nazis wanted published would be published, and that those stories would be written in a way that supported the narrative of the party. The Editorial Law made a clear and ultimately successful attempt to Nazify journalism in the Reich. But the question we want to ask is, how would this assist the Nazis in maintaining their control? Well, consider this quote from Max Rutschner, who wrote this opinion piece in a Swiss German language newspaper on October the 10th, 1933. As a result, the role of the press is being fundamentally changed. It essentially consists no longer discussing, but interpreting, helping the government to support the decisions of the government with the arguments it is able to provide. The role of the press in Nazi Germany would now be to support the Nazi regime, not to offer questions about any decision they might make. All news consumed by the German people could therefore be easily censored and further used as propaganda to promote Nazi ideology. This gave them yet another method to consolidate their control over the state. Now we come to discuss two separate but related laws which we classify together as the Hitler Youth Laws. The first of these was the Law on the Hitler Youth, which was developed on the 1st of December 1936. It initially placed all German youth under the jurisdiction of the Hitler Youth, ensuring that the regime could further its indoctrination of the young in Germany. The main articles worth understanding were Article 1 and 2. They stated, all of the German youth in the Reich is organized within the Hitler Youth. The German youth, besides being reared within the family and school, shall be educated physically, intellectually, and morally in the spirit of National Socialism to serve the people and community through the Hitler Youth. At this point, it's important to note, membership in the Hitler Youth was not mandatory, however, it was heavily encouraged. By the end of 1936, around 65% of eligible youth, some 5 million teenagers, had joined either willingly or coerced into doing so. And the organization was increasingly being set up as a mechanism to ensure loyalty to Hitler and to the Nazis, loyalty from all young people. Other youth groups throughout the state, such as the Catholic youth groups, had all been closed down. And at this point, it was only a matter of time before membership of the Hitler Youth become compulsory. A few years later, the next logical step was taken with the second execution order to the Law on the Hitler Youth in March 1939. This made membership of the Hitler Youth a legal requirement for all Germans aged 10 to 18. All juveniles are to be registered with the respective Hitler Youth leader for induction into the Hitler Youth before 15th March on the calendar year during which they complete their 10th year of age. Now, of course, certain groups would not be permitted to join. Article 7, for instance, forbade Jews from membership in the Hitler Youth, which is unsurprising. And beyond this, the second execution order to the Law on the Hitler Youth gave harsh penalties, both financial and potentially prison time, faced by the child's parents or any other person who might encourage a young person from joining the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was used as a way to prepare the young for the world as the Nazis saw it, the boys to become soldiers for the Reich, the girls as wives and mothers. But more than this, it aided in the indoctrination that occurred at school. Indoctrination into the ideology of National Socialism, into Nazism, into obedience to the Führer, Adolf Hitler. In our last video, I mentioned we would not at this point be looking at the Nuremberg laws, as they were more about ideology and the persecution of minorities and not actually about methods of control. And so this law, which is likely to be considered the first of the anti-Semitic laws the Nazis passed, created on the 7th of April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, might seem a bit odd. The reason, however, I think it's important in terms of the regime's ability to control the state is in fact what it accomplished was the loyalty of the state bureaucracy, their obedience to their new Nazi masters. So, with that introduction, let's have a look at the actual text of the legislation. It says, for the restoration of a national professional civil service and for the simplification of administration, civil servants may be discharged from office in accordance with the following regulations, even when there are no grounds for such action under existing law. Civil servants of non-Aryan descent are to be retired. Now, if we firstly consider who would be part of this civil service, we could include teachers. By removing non-Aryan members of the teaching profession, the Nazis could ensure their indoctrination in the classroom could continue unabated. It would include judges, so that Nazi interpretation of the laws could take place, so that Hitler would not have to accept judiciary decisions he disliked, such as those that followed the Reichstag fire, and their findings that the Communist Party as a whole was not to blame. It also included professors and tenured positions in universities, along with any government position. Anyone not of Aryan descent could not hold any of these positions. It is important at this point, I think, to understand that this law was not made without opposition. President Hindenburg, in a letter sent to Hitler on April the 4th, slightly before this law would be announced, expressed his concerns in this way. Judges, lawyers, and officials of the judiciary who are disabled war veterans and whose record in office is flawless have been forcibly sent on leave and are later to be dismissed for the sole reason that they are of Jewish descent. It is quite intolerable for me personally. Now, as a World War I general, Hindenburg called on Hitler to show humanity and support for those who had sacrificed so much for the fatherland. Hitler responded to the president on the 5th of April, and he attempted to justify the decision and to take the question somewhat away from the question of Jews. However, at this point, still consolidating his power, he was forced to submit, at least partially, to the will of Hindenburg. He wrote, "In general, the primary aim of this cleansing process is only to restore a certain sound and natural balance, and secondly, to remove from official positions of national significance those elements to which one cannot entrust Germany's survival." And so the initial law which Hitler had envisaged, which would have completely removed all non-Aryans from positions in the civil service, would be watered down slightly to allow those who had served in the First World War, or who were the children of those who had died in that war, or who had held their positions prior to 1914. Now, these meager protections would last only as long as the Nazis were forced to keep them. So with the death of Hindenburg, the final protections for Jewish minorities in these professions would disappear completely, and Nazi control over those professions would increase even more so. Now, if you look back to our video on the collapse of the Weimar Republic, see the link above, we discussed that one of the reasons for the failure of the Weimar regime was their inability to control the bureaucracy. Richard Evans described Weimar as weak in its political legitimacy, unloved and undefended by its servants in the army and bureaucracy. US journalist Edgar Moura, writing at the time, put it this way: "What can be said for a republic," this is the Weimar Republic, "that allows its laws to be interpreted by monarchist judges, its government should be administered by old-time functionaries, watches passively while reactionary school teachers teach its children to despise the present freedom?" The Nazis were not about to make the same mistake. They had learnt from the failings of Weimar. They realized they needed to ensure the control over these important bureaucratic and governmental positions in order to secure their control over Germany as a whole. The final piece of legislation that we want to have a look at are the Gleichshaltung Laws. Now, I have searched high and low for the text of these laws to show you and to put a quote in here for you. I can't find it anywhere in English. I can't even find it in a German translation that I might be able to get Google to translate. So if you do find a transcript of these laws, please do put a link in the comments below so I can find it. I'd love to add it here. Regardless, let's get started with what I can say about two significant laws that enabled the Nazis to coordinate their control over Germany. The first Gleichschaltung Law, or sometimes the first law for the coordination of the Länder, was issued on the 31st of March 1933. This dissolved the state diets. Diets is a word for parliaments in the various German states. These state parliaments would then be recreated in lines of the March 1933 Reichstag elections, and this of course gave Nazis control over them. The one state this didn't apply to was Prussia, who the Nazis already had a control over at that point. Only a week later, the second Gleichschaltung Law of April 7th, would take this reform even further. A Reichsgovernor would be appointed to each state in Germany, and that Reichsgovernor would be answerable only to Wilhelm Frick and through that to Adolf Hitler, in order to carry out the will of the regime. These governors had almost absolute power within their states, and so the regime's control was consolidated into the hands of a relatively small amount of very powerful men who could ensure that Hitler's will was followed. A few months later, on the 30th of January 1934, the law concerning the reconstruction of the Reich would formally remove all remaining vestiges of the state's power, transforming independent states into provinces, still under the command of a Reich governor and Frick, and therefore Hitler, and soon the Reichsrat itself would be dissolved completely. These laws had the effect of uniting Germany behind Nazi leadership. This was something that Goebbels promoted in propaganda as one of the major achievements of the regime, uniting Germany under Hitler. This completed the Nazification of the state. And it goes without saying, really, that this coordination of the state under centralized government control gave Hitler and his party a direct line of control to each province of Germany. This ensured their will was carried out, and it removed the potential opposition that the states may have offered, such as they had under the Weimar regime. This has been History for the HSC and our second deep dive into even more Nazi legislation. Today we've seen how the Editorial Law, the Hitler Youth Laws, the Law for the Restoration of the Professional and Civil Services, and the Gleichshaltung Laws gave the Nazi regime instruments of control over the state of Germany. On the screen, you can see now a suggested video, and the subscribe button you can use if you want. Remember, you can download this end screen as a poster using the links in the description below. Next time on History for the HSC, in our study of the power and authority topic, we'll have a look at the use of terror and repression in the state of Nazi Germany. Until then, keep studying.